and it should just never be done by anyone other than an anesthesiologist. And I'm not advocating the treatment that I used for Michael for anyone else. That was a one of a kind. It was a unique situation with a unique individual. It worked in my hands. The 25 to 30 times that I gave him Propofol over the 8 years that I knew him, we were successful. I was very careful. I'm a trained professional. I was an expert in the administration of that particular medication. And I was very careful the way I used it with him. And again, if you look at those 8 years that I was with him, he didn't miss concerts. He met his obligations, and he was in a fairly decent state.
Welcome to the Better Each Day podcast radio show with Bruce Hilliard. Today and every day, reaching out for innovative ideas in every way. Today's show is brought to you by your future. It comes with a lifetime guarantee. Make a better each day now, baby. Better in every way.
Maybe the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon tour wouldn't have been the miraculous success it was. Maybe the remarkable 60s and 70s tours of Humble Pie, Peter Frampton, the J. Giles Band, Emerson Lake and Palmer, and Three Dog Night, not to mention T-Rex, would have not been the shows people still talk about. Then there's the different outcome of Michael Jackson's untimely death that may have been avoided had he remained under the close scrutiny and expert advice of our guest, Dr. Neil Ratner.
I'm in Woodstock, New York.
Woodstock, home of the famous rock festival that was never in Woodstock. It was in
Bethel, which is about 60 miles from here. Yeah, the good thing is, though, the town has greatly benefited from that festival, whether it was here or not. You know, we're a music town anyway, and, people still come here looking for the site.
Yeah, I have a friend that lives on the Isle of Wight, and they had a rock festival there, and he said a lot of people just came and stayed there, not just, took some acid and stayed there mentally, but they actually moved there and retired there.
I think in terms of, Woodstock, it was kind of the other way around. This was an area that it's like the longest continuous colony of the arts, and then you had all of those 60 Bob Dylan, Albert Grossman's, crew that came up here. And so I think that actually stimulated the idea for the festival.
Where were you born?
I was actually born in Brooklyn, New York.
My roommate in college was from New York. He talked just like you. His name was Vinny Nigro, and I always called him Vinny Ramone because I had just opened for the Ramones. And he was an Italian-looking guy. He looked like he belonged in the Ramones, so everybody kind of knew him as Ramone in college. One of those things where you get out of college and everybody had a nickname and you never knew who anybody's name was, kind of a deal. But
yeah, right. I hear that.
Your story is as unique as they come. You started out, you were in like all the school drummer things. You probably had to study the rudiments, so you're formally trained and everything. And the next logical thing is to play in a rock and roll band. Yeah,
totally. That's definitely the way I came up. I like to tell people I was born with rhythms in my head. I had to get them out somehow. And much to my parents' dismay, it was usually silverware on the table or banging on my knees or, some ridiculous way of playing rhythms. But yeah, I went through the school bands and the school orchestra, and I took some drum lessons, and I was a child of the 60s. I'm 69. I'll be 70 this summer. So I grew up right in that ripe time.
Yeah.
And, of course, Beatles on Ed Sullivan, British Invasion. We all wanted to be rock stars, right?
Absolutely. It was just the only thing to be. I was astronaut and rock star, and NFL football looked pretty cool. But they had a, what should I say, pygmy league for football, I could be on that. But yeah, so
no, the Pop Warner League. That's what it was. Kids, right?
Yeah, so I would have been 22 years old on the Pop Warner League.
Oh yeah, a little old for that.
Yeah, I'm still kind of a dwarf. But
so you and I are contemporaries. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'm 63, but I was totally into music from. I never was an Elvis fan, but I was aware of what was going on. It was an extremely pivotal point in American history music, which faded over into Britain. The whole story. It came back with the English guys got a hold of the blues guys, and wow, what a thing. And when I was told that, I thought, that doesn't sound anything like Delta blues to me. But, it took me years to kind of fill in the connection. And, it's wonderful how it turned into like the Animals and the Kinks, the Beatles, of course. I haven't done an interview yet where somebody didn't bring up the Beatles. It's
interesting because when I created this project, I put a team together of the people that I worked with in the music business. And one of the guys was a media specialist. He had been one of the early guys at MTV. And when I first wrote the book, I didn't really focus that much on my early music business experience. I just didn't, I didn't value it as much as I should have. And he's the guy who's probably 20 years younger than me. And he said, no, you're making a mistake. That's very valuable experience, and we should start a Facebook page, Neil Ratner Rock Doc, and just start talking about your old experiences and do it whatever you want. And so about 5 years ago now, almost 5 years ago, I started this page, Neil Ratner Rock Doc. And I started it just hooking into this day in rock and roll, trying to find historical stuff. And then if I had a personal story, great. If I didn't, I would just try and find stuff that people didn't know. I would look for stuff that I didn't know. I figured if I don't know it, they don't know it. And, I've got like 25,000 followers now, and I've got a YouTube channel, and I do live videos, and I got a little spot on Radio Woodstock up here to do This Week in Rock on Saturdays. And it's unbelievable to me how important it is to not only people of my generation, but apparently people of all generations. Music is the soundtrack of our lives.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to know a little bit more about who made it and how did they make it and what were they thinking when they made it, and, stuff like that.
I've listened to your podcast. It's fascinating. And I've always been a historian wannabe on it, but I'm finding it the coolest thing about getting older definitely isn't my looks, but it's being able to connect the dots. What do you mean, the
hair in places that never grew before?
I'm not good at growing hair at all, anywhere, actually. But the connect the dots factor of, that guy worked with him and somebody helped him there and this happened and that happened. And then I read about you, and you are a vast warehouse of, like I said, one of the most pivotal points in the history of music. From the drummer thing, this is interesting. You just sort of serendipitously ran into Rick Derringer, of all people.
Of all people, Rick Derringer. Yeah, I in between my sophomore and junior year of college. Of course, I didn't make it as the high school musician. I did go off to college. And in between my sophomore and junior year, I took an apartment in New York City because I got a training program gig in a hospital, which I thought would help me get into medical school. And, the East Village in the summer of '69 was a pretty cool place to be. The Fillmore was down the block, the Anderson Theater, Electric Circus across town. Very much of a hippie haven in a strange kind of way. And, I moved into this apartment. Lo and behold, I start hearing music. I have upstairs neighbors who are obviously musicians. And it didn't take me long for wanting to go and meet them. So I just, walked upstairs, knocked on the door. This guy opens the door. I don't really know who he is because, Rick had been in the McCoys, obviously. They had Hang On Sloopy, but I was never really paid attention to what they looked like. But, he took me inside. We talked. I realized who he was. And he had just started to play with Johnny Winter. So it was an incredible summer. He introduced me to his friends. I met Johnny. I met Steve Paul, the guy who managed them. Rick was also very much a part of the Andy Warhol scene. And so he took me to the factory. I met all of Andy's crazies,
Wow.
who by the end of the summer will come into my apartment.
You ever have to pinch yourself? Because that's that was the place to be really at that period of time.
Yeah, I mean, but again, when you're living it, it doesn't mean the same thing as when you look back on it.
Yeah, that's true. I've heard this said before. For some reason, there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of things that go on you kind of forget about. So years later, you look back on your life and it looks like a finely honed novel,
Absolutely. Also, the time.
Did that really happen?
The times were so different.
Yeah, we still had a war in Vietnam, and you were of an age where that wasn't a good thing for you.
No, so Rick and I became friendly. The summer ended, and I went back to college,
Yeah.
But Rick, I had a little band that summer, and Rick had heard the band, and he knew that I could play the drums, and I said, hey, I don't really want to go back to college. Get me a gig, meaning get me a gig as a drummer. And about a year later, he called me up and telling me about his gig with Johnny and Edgar, Johnny's brother, and Edgar puts together a band, and I was sure he was going to ask me to be the drummer. And then he says, we want you to be the road manager.
No! But you were cool with that.
Not at first. At first I strongly objected. What do you mean, road manager? What the heck is a road manager? I don't want to. He said, no, listen, be smart. Take it. You'll meet people. You never know. And he convinced me that it would be a clever way for me to enter the music business. I always thought it would be temporary. Something good would happen, and, I'd meet some hot band that needed a drummer, and I'd transition again. Mm-hmm. But, within a couple of months, I realized road manager was a serious gig, and it needed a lot of attention. And so the dreams of being a drummer faded as the years went by.
But as a road manager, you ended up working with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Pink Floyd, T-Rex. Imagine the list goes on.
Actually, as a road manager was with Edgar. And then the next thing, I was an assistant manager to a guy named D. Anthony. I left Edgar after about a year, and I went to work for a guy named D. Anthony. He was looking for an assistant. He was a real major player back in the day. He managed ELP in America, Humble Pie, Jay Giles, Peter Frampton, and
wow.
He taught me management. He taught me a ton about the business. He introduced me to his friends like Bill Graham and Frank Barcelona from Premier Talent. And I ostensibly went on tour with his groups to do box office because, as you know, Bruce, back in the day, groups actually collected cash.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody trusted anybody, and so I was kind of the bag man. And then when I went on an ELP tour, they were in transition, and they asked me to come to England as their quote-unquote general operations director, which just meant that they had gotten a new label. They hired a guy to run the label. They had their overall manager, and I would run all of their live whatever. And so I moved to London, and I did some tours with them. And then I had this concept, this idea. I noticed that all these big groups were using multiple companies, sound, lighting, trucking, and it got very confusing, particularly in the day before cell phones and computers. And I thought, like a circus, why not everything under one roof? Why not one company that provides all of these services? And I decided that I would create that company. And the serendipitous thing that happened there was when I moved to London, shortly after I was living there a couple of months, and I get a surprise phone call from an old girlfriend from the University of Vermont. She had moved to London because she married a guy named Peter Watts. And Peter Watts happened to be the chief sound technician for the Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
So, of course, we got together, and Peter and I became really friendly. And, you know, I still needed some pieces to fit together in order to create this company that I wanted to create. You know, I wasn't a technical guy. You know, I was an organizational guy. And so I still needed the technical sound and lighting people. He had some very good friends who had probably the hottest sound and lighting company in London. And they were splitting apart. And the guy who was going to keep all the equipment was looking for somebody. He said, I'm going to introduce you. This is the guy you need, and you guys should form this company. And sure enough, we did. We did a few little things for like the Bee Gees Genesis. And then I went back to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I did a huge tour for them. And then I got the most surprising phone call, you know, of all, when Peter called and said, you know, we've been recording this Dark Side of the Moon album. We tried to go out and tour it a little bit, but I want to do quadraphonic sound. The sound's wrong. The lighting's wrong. I've already talked to Steve O'Rourke, Floyd's manager. We've never used an outside company, but he's agreed that you're coming with us. And Circus Talents Limited, that was the name of my company appropriately, is going to be, you know, a part of this tour. And sure enough, you know, I met with Steve O'Rourke. We worked out a deal. And my company did the Dark Side of the Moon tour.
You were a pioneer. You say you weren't technically oriented. Well, you found some great people because a lot of this stuff had never been done before. I think the artists just come up, hey, here's what we want to do. You know, we're going to fly to Mars and come back and just figure out a way to do it.
Absolutely, that's the way it was. And you had crazy people like Peter and their lighting designer, Arthur Max, who would stop at nothing to make that happen. You know, and use all kinds of innovative new techniques, lasers when nobody knew what a laser was. Mm-hmm. You know, yeah. So definitely, that was it was like that in those days. And you know, the tour was so successful from a production point of view. And of course, after Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd took a break, and Steve O'Rourke gave Peter permission to continue with me with this huge setup that we had. And we went on and did T-Rex. We went on and did Three Dog Night.
Jeremiah was a bullfrog.
Three Dog Night.
You know. Three Dog Night. I did their last world tour. Parts of it, the American section anyway.
Yeah,
crazy guys there, man.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, tell me about them.
Well,
it was an interesting band. You know, who did that? You know, you have three lead singers, and they all perform well together. They all sing together. They were picking out songs from everywhere. You know, that was an interesting concept, and they were great.
They were great. They were each individually great singers, and their harmonies were like fabulous.
Yeah.
You know, and they did songs that people liked. You know, they did some of those Hoyt Axton songs, Joy to the World.
Yeah.
Or was that Hoyt Axton, or that was his mother, I think, that wrote that song, believe it or not.
Oh, I always thought it was him.
Or maybe it was him.
Yeah, I don't know.
Jeremiah was a bullfrog.
Yeah,
right?
I'll Google that after this. He was in a movie with what were the Gremlins. I think he was in that movie.
That's right. That's right. That's right. He was in that movie, which is a crazy little movie too.
So you could win the column on Jeopardy on Rock Trivia, I'm sure.
You know, funny you should mention that. I wasn't a Jeopardy fan until this guy who's won over $1 million.
Yeah.
And now I watch, you know, every night. We can't have dinner until Jeopardy's over.
That's interesting. You know, if I had a checklist of really important bands through that era that we were talking in the late 60s, coming into the 70s probably, I think you named them all. I can't think of anybody else. And
well, you know, it was such a great concept, and I was really there at a wonderful time. You know, it was really the birth of the rock and roll business back in those days.
Yeah, like this.
And it was fabulous, you know. Probably not so fabulous as I was living it, because, you know, as you're living these things, and, you know, as I like to tell people, you know, people talk about, oh, Dark Side of the Moon tour. That must have been an amazing tour to be on. Yeah, it was. But I was working.
Yeah.
You know, I got up early in the morning. I went to bed late at night, you know, and I had to make sure things went as planned. So, you know, it's not like smoking a joint and going to a Pink Floyd concert.
That's exactly what I was going to, the metaphor, because where I was coming from, when I first heard of Dark Side of the Moon, it was like, yeah, man, get stoned and listen to this record. And the next thing was, even if you don't get stoned, after you listen to it for years later, you know, you'll get a contact buzz from Dark Side of the Moon or something. And that was my angle on it, but I'm sure it was just hard work and, you know, lots of things that could go wrong from your standpoint.
Yeah, and again, we were not in a digital age back then.
Not at all.
And we were running lots of trucks and lots of power and, you know, new types of equipment that people weren't that familiar with if it broke down. Yeah, it was a trip.
Now, from drummer to road manager, how did the rock doc thing come about? Now you went on to finish school, or?
The rock doc thing actually is an interesting story. I did all this touring and whatever, and then I had this epiphany where I decided I don't want the rock and roll. What happened was I was in a hospital. I got kidney stones, you know, the rock and roll lifestyle. I ended up with kidney stones, and I was in a hospital in London, and it was late at night, and I saw a movie, an American movie called Not as a Stranger. And the movie focuses on a bunch of residents as they go through their training and become doctors. And it was late at night, and it really spoke to me.
Yeah.
And you know, I had this epiphany that, I don't need to do this anymore. I've accomplished what I set out to accomplish. Not going to be the drummer. Put that on the side for whenever. And let me go back to that original childhood dream of being a doctor. And so I sold the business to my partner, came back to America, had trouble getting into a college because nobody thought I was serious with the kind of background that I had, but finally got accepted to a college on Long Island, Hofstra. Worked hard because I had been dismissed for low scholarship just walking out of school, you know, to take the job with Edgar.
Yeah.
Got good grades, but, you know, medical school is a tough nut to crack. And I was older, and it was at a time in the mid 70s, roughly, where many Vietnam vets were coming back, and a lot of them had gone to school, wanted to be professional people, and so it was hard to get into medical school. Couldn't get into an American medical school, but there were alternatives because some foreign schools, seeing the problems in America, had set up programs catering to the overflow of the students who couldn't get in. And I picked Guadalajara, Mexico, since I had a little background in Spanish, not enough. Had to go to language school for a couple of months to pass, you know, the equivalency exam to get in, and then spent the next 4 years in Mexico in medical school. Had to do a year of unpaid internship to get back into the American system, and thought I wanted to be a surgeon, did 2 years of surgical residency, and then the guys on the other end of the table, the anesthesiologist, said, "You're making a mistake. With your background, you should be here." And they were right. I've had it with surgery anyway, you know, and I became an anesthesiologist.
So from there, more names here. Who's more famous than Michael Jackson? You worked with Michael Jackson. What was that like?
Yeah, well, so I became an anesthesiologist, and I didn't want to be a normal anesthesiologist. I couldn't see myself in a hospital, being on call every third night. Well, actually, wait, let me go back a step. I'm finishing up being an anesthesiologist, and I'm not sure I even want to do this anymore. It was so many years of hard work, so many years in hospitals. I just wasn't sure. It was, and so I tried to think of what I could do. And it was the early days of MTV. And I noticed that many media outlets were getting doctors on their staff. You know, you turn on the news and there'd be a doctor giving a report on medicine. And I thought, wow, MTV, those people need a doctor more than anybody. And I'm a doctor. I had real experience in the music business. I'm the rock doc. I should be the rock doc. And so that's when I created that concept. And I actually went to MTV through a lawyer I knew. I got to MTV, and they loved the concept. But it was so early in the game they only had insurance companies. They only had record companies as sponsors. And the record company wasn't going to sponsor a program like mine. They told me, go out and get a sponsor. We'll put it on the air. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it. Tabled the whole rock doc thing. And instead, looked at the anesthesia world and said, what could I do that'll be different? How can I be entrepreneurial? And I noticed that in New York City, doctors were not operating in their office as much as they wanted to because no anesthesiologists had devoted themselves to office surgery because the drugs and the monitors were really geared towards operating rooms in hospitals, not outpatient surgery. But with my level of experience, I figured, I've got a very good knowledge of anesthesia. I've got a handle on these drugs. I can do it. And so I was one of the first to create the specialty of office-based anesthesiology in New York City. So, Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
I started this practice. I did it mostly in the cosmetic and plastic surgery world because those were the guys who had the kind of patients who didn't want to go to hospitals, right? And they weren't treated very well in hospitals because their patients were just day patients. And, outpatient surgery wasn't really big back in that day. So I built a practice with the cosmetic surgery world. I had this one particular office, and we did a lot of celebrities. And when celebrities were going to come in, he would usually give me a heads up first, and we had a practice of speaking to them the night before surgery. And he called me up one day, and he played a little game, don't you want to guess, and blah, 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 blah. And eventually he told me, Michael Jackson. And about a half hour later, Michael called me on the phone, and it certainly was Michael Jackson. We had a conversation. I gave him anesthesia for a small procedure the next day. And if Michael likes you, he'll take your phone number, right? He'll take your phone number because he likes to speak to people at ungodly hours of the night. That's his MO, right? He'll call you at 2:30, 3:30, 4:30 in the morning. Hey, what are you doing? Now, obviously, part of it was because he had this terrible sleep problem, which I discovered over time. But after the procedure, over the course of the next year, we became quite friendly with late-night phone conversations.
So he trusted you as a friend, it sounds like.
Well, I was so different than any doctor he had ever encountered. I was a real music guy.
Yeah.
We could talk music. Talk music, talk medicine. That was very unusual. And Michael got off on it. And, we were able to really develop this great friendship over the telephone.
That and you're not freaking out because he's Michael Jackson. You've worked in the business. You've met a lot of people. And it sounds like that'd be refreshing for him.
It was not only refreshing for him, but I was able to build a good practice because of that fact, because I had been around celebrity. And, don't forget the plastic surgery world is very celebrity-driven as well.
Yeah.
You're as famous as the celebrities that you do surgery on, really. And so they liked the fact, the surgeons liked the fact that I didn't get impressed, that I could treat everybody the same. Having been around celebrity, I understood that it's very easy to get caught up in the magic, so to speak.
Yeah.
And when you get caught up in the magic, you start doing things you shouldn't do.
That was my question.
And you start acting stupid.
Yeah, rather than doing what you've done, that's routine, that works. I think, this is my theory, some doctors get caught up in the high-profile thing and blow it.
No question about it, and particularly in anesthesiology, whether it's a homeless guy on the street, a celebrity, or your wife, you better do everything exactly the same. Do not vary your routine. Do not change anything. Because when you start to change and make exceptions, bad things can happen.
Yeah.
And so again, I was uniquely kind of qualified to do office anesthesia because I could deal with the kind of patients that would come into the office.
That is so interesting. Yeah, you wouldn't think it would work that way, but Propofol, Was that a new drug during this period of time, and how did that come into play?
Yeah, so I told you the story that I started, was one of the first to do this new specialty of office-based anesthesia.
Yeah.
And I mentioned the fact that the drugs were bad. Well, within a few years of when I started my practice, now, I knew I was riding the fence, so to speak. So I was always looking for new monitors, new drugs, anything that could make my life simpler and safer and the patient's life safer. And I started to read about Propofol in the mid-'80s because it had been discovered and it was used first in Europe. And of course, I read all the anesthesia journals and whatnot. And when I read about the drug, I realized that this would be a miracle drug for anesthesiologists, particularly for office-based anesthesiologists. The drug that we would use, the gold standard, the drug that was used prior to Propofol to put patients to sleep, was a drug called sodium pentothal. And sodium pentothal was a very difficult drug to control, very depressing to respiration, to blood pressure, and worst of all, for office surgery, it left patients nauseous. And you can't send a vomiting patient, a nauseous patient out in the street. Don't forget, office surgery, they got to go home, that day, an hour later. And so using sodium pentothal and some of the other drugs that we had made it very difficult. When I saw Propofol, I knew that's going to be the drug. As soon as it became available in America, I was one of the first, I believe, to use it, particularly in office practice. I introduced some of the surgeons that I worked with to Propofol because they weren't even aware of it yet. And I became an expert in its usage. And I had used Propofol on every patient, literally thousands of patients, over the course of the 8-year period that it was, more or less, between when I started using Propofol and Michael came to the office. I became friendly, as I said, with Michael, right? And I started to see him more the beginning of 95. I told you we had all these late-night phone calls, whatever, saw him occasionally. But then the beginning of, actually towards the middle end of 1995, he started to show up more in New York because he was going to do a 2-concert show at the Beacon Theater, which was going to be taped by HBO. And so he was in New York now. And he would show up at the office periodically for this or that. Nothing major, just this or that. And we were talking frequently, and I could see he was not doing well. He looked drawn. He was very skinny to begin with. He looked even worse. His color was terrible, dehydrated. But, what's what it was. And then on Thanksgiving Day, 1995, I was having Thanksgiving dinner with my parents at my apartment in the city. Phone rang. Michael's on the phone. Before too long, he's hysterical crying. Help me. I can't take it anymore.
Oh, man.
They're working me too hard. Talk to my other doctors, please be my doctor, help me. And I was sort of flabbergasted. It was like, yeah, what am I supposed to do? You got all these other doctors, why are you calling on me?
Yeah.
But, he felt comfortable with me. And I'll tell you a strange thing, because people will think, well, you're an anesthesiologist. How could you be his doctor? I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense. Anesthesiology is a very interesting specialty in that we don't treat disease. We facilitate what a surgeon does. Having said that, people with every kind of disease walk through an operating room. And so you have to be expert at every disease. Know medications, know pathophysiology, know how anesthesia is going to affect a diabetic, a hypertensive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it wasn't so unusual to take a general practitioner kind of role. Plus, I had started to do some charity work in Africa, where I was put in that position as well, and there's some great stories in the book about it. I won't go into it now. At any rate, I spoke to some of Michael's doctors, and I decided that I could create a unique treatment just for him to help him get through these shows. And it would involve Propofol, but there were 2 other problems to me that were worse than his sleep situation. And one was the fact that he was severely dehydrated, and the second was the fact that he was nutritionally depleted. And so I thought, the Propofol will give him a couple hours of what he's looking for, even though it's not true sleep, but it's not any different than a doctor-prescribed sleeping pill, really, in terms of the kind of sleep that it is. But more importantly, I could use the opportunity to give him lots of fluids, electrolytes, nutritional supplements, and hopefully do this a couple of times in the couple of weeks we had before the shows, get him, so that he could get through the shows. And we did it a couple of times. Things went well. And I think it was the third time we were going to do it. And this was separated by days. And I explained to him, this is not normal. This is way out of the box. This only works, because I'm an expert at what this is. This is only a temporary solution. We're going to transition to something else. And so the third time we were supposed to do it, he doesn't show up. He's hours late, and I get this call. He's on the floor of the stage of the Beacon Theater. He's collapsed. The EMS is here. You're his doctor. What do you want us to do? Yeah, it freaked me out, but I quickly put together a team, and, we got him to a hospital that we wanted so that we could control the team and everything. And, he stayed there for about a week, got better. And then we continued our friendship. And then a couple of years later, I got a call, come on the history tour. And it didn't work out that I could go on the whole tour. There were various reasons not. But I did end up going on the end of the history tour. And then I was with Michael every time he played publicly from then, really until he died. Because I stopped seeing him in 2002. But he never played again publicly. Last time he played publicly was for the 9/11 concert in October of 2001, and I was with him then. And then he never played publicly again. The next time he was supposed to play publicly was the This Is It concert.
Yeah, which never came about.
No, they never did. He died, a week before they were supposed to happen. And we all know that story.
Yeah, no, here's the story that I read just enough to get confused. Conrad Murray, I believe was his name. How did he come into the picture?
Mm-hmm. After 2002, I was no longer in touch with Michael, and so I know what you know.
Not about.
I don't have any inside information on anything beyond 2002. I know what you know. I know what you read. So I don't even really know the exact answer to that question.
But everything was completely out of your hands at that point, and it sounds like you were...
From April of 2002, that was it. That was the last time I ever saw Michael. Or, my wife spoke to him. I ran into some problems in my medical practice. I wanted to expand my practice in the late 80s, and I noticed in vitro fertilization, fertility,
mm-hmm.
And I knew that would be a kind of specialty that I could get involved in. I knew before they knew. I knew they were going to have to set up operating rooms, and I knew they were going to need an anesthesiologist. And I joined the Fertility Society and walked around with a bunch of cards. Nobody knew who I was. But I got calls like crazy, developed a huge fertility practice. Now, we thought that the insurance companies would be responsible for at least the first cycle. Quickly found out that they weren't. So all of the other fertility experts went to a fee-for-service model, which included anesthesia for the procedure. I had one doctor, very, very high-profile doctor in New York City. I built an operating room. I had done zillions of surgeries with him. He said, every woman deserves the right to have a baby. This is bullshit. This isn't right. I'm going to bill it as gynecology. Let them do what they want. I thought I was on solid ground because I was a contract player. I was outsourced, and I didn't overbill. I gave good anesthesia. But 10 years later, the feds showed up. I got caught in the web. I turned, I decided to cooperate with the government. Got screwed anyway, and ended up going to jail for a minute.
Jeez, for thinking outside the box. And really bad. I'll edit that part out, I think. You're working with John Lappin as a manager, correct?
He's our agent. He's our publicist. I actually have another manager. My manager is actually a guy named Stuart Young. Yeah. Yes, Stuart's an interesting character. When I was working for D. Anthony, and I was on the road with Emerson Lake and Palmer, that's when I found out that I found out in a strange way. One day, Greg Lake says to me, "I want you to meet someone." I said, "Okay." And we were in Miami. And, go to sound check, and I see this English guy, long hair, sitting there, stern-looking face. And I start talking to him. He says, "I'm the new manager." And I know we need a good tour manager. Will you come to London and be the tour manager?
Yeah.
And I took the gig. I left D. Stuart did end up being their manager, but Stuart went on. I mean, he's managed ELP for the entire length of time. And then he managed them individually for a while. But he also managed Billy Squier, Cyndi Lauper, AC/DC for 10 years. Now he's got Foreigner and a whole slew of other people. And he and I have been friends for 40-odd years. So when I decided to do this, I approached Stuart and I said, "Hey, And at first he didn't want to do it because he had never done an author or anything. But eventually he thought there was merit and value. And we've been working together on this for like 5 years now.
I'm seeing
He brought John in. He knew John.
Okay.
Because John was working with Foreigner for about 12 years or something.
Oh. John introduced me to Robert Barry. Are you familiar with him?
I'm familiar. I don't know him, but I know who he is.
Yeah, he worked with Keith Emerson on some of the final recordings that Keith ever made. And
yes, him and Mark Bonilla, I think, was another one. They all worked together.
You worked with Keith personally?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was, tour manager for Emerson Lake and Palmer. As a matter of fact, if you know the history of Keith Emerson, he was sort of like the Jimi Hendrix of the keyboards, right?
Yeah, I understand.
And he had this
pretty brutal on him sometimes.
Yeah, really. And he had these knives, right?
Oh, knives.
He had these knives that he had these big knives. And he would put the Hammond organ on top of himself, and he would stab the organ with these knives. There's an interesting story, actually, about one of the knives. I had to carry the knives. I was like the road manager. And back in the day, you could do that. You could go through. There was no TSA. So you could do that. I had these big, huge knives in my briefcase. But one knife was really special and really important because Keith had been in a band previously called The Nice, right? Mm-hmm. Before he was in Emerson Lake and Palmer.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, the MC5? They had a very famous frontman named Lemmy. At any rate, Lemmy had been road manager or one of the roadies for The Nice, and Lemmy gave Keith that knife. So it was a very precious knife to him. But Keith and I became close. We did. And even after, when I was in my training to be a doctor, we kept in contact. I went down and saw him once in the Bahamas. He had a place in the Bahamas. So yeah, I had a nice relationship with Keith. I saw him, the last time I saw him, I hadn't seen him in many years. We reconnected, a year or two before his death out in L.A. And it was great. It was like, we had been in continual communication over all those years.
It blew me away when I heard he took his own life. And I thought, I guess there's an inclination to think that because somebody is a superstar, their life is perfect, and it ain't so, and I don't know exactly what happened. No. He had some problems just going on with his life in general, but I understand he had some problems with his hands as well.
Yeah, well, I think it was the problems with his hand that really created all the other problems, because basically he couldn't play the way he played anymore. And that freaked him out. And actually, Stuart Young, the guy I was telling about, was his manager and helping him out. And Stuart tried to transition him to become a conductor, which he actually did a couple of times in the latter couple of months of his life, but it just didn't work. And, he just, again, it's that whole, rock star emotional instability in a way, having been something once and then not being that something anymore, and how do you deal with it? And then my hands don't work anymore, and, you know, one thing leads to another. It's a terrible, unfortunate thing.
That's a sad deal. You're obviously a fun guy to be around, which I always say is one of the best compliments you can get. But you're trustworthy, and I see that throughout this whole thing. That if you didn't have the track record you had, you know, you wouldn't have had the stories to tell. They would have never happened. And well, you know, I think it's important just to be yourself and to be honest with people. And I think it was my realness and my honesty, you know, maybe sometimes too honest, you know, that attracted these people to me, because a lot of times celebrities don't get people like that. You know, the people that surround celebrities, you know, buy into that magic, so to speak, and then become totally, you know, subservient to that celebrity and yes people. Yeah, right. Yeah. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. You know, they lose their judgment. They lose their moral and ethical judgment, and they start doing things that they never should be doing. Dangerous. Oh, yeah. People die because of it. Obviously, yeah. And you've seen it from the front row seat. Now, I have to ask this question. Was Conrad Murray actually an anesthesiologist? No, to my knowledge, he was a cardiologist, and I will say this. A drug like Propofol should never, ever, ever, ever be given by a non-anesthesiologist. It's a serious medication, and it needs to be given under very serious circumstances, and a patient needs to be fully monitored, and it should just never be done by anyone other than an anesthesiologist. And I'm not advocating the treatment that I used for Michael for anyone else. That was a one of a kind. Mm-hmm. It was a unique situation with a unique individual. It worked in my hands. The 25 to 30 times that I gave him Propofol over the 8 years that I knew him, we were successful. I was very careful. I'm a trained professional. I was an expert in the administration of that particular medication. And I was very careful the way I used it with him. And again, if you look at those 8 years that I was with him, he didn't miss concerts. He met his obligations, and he was in a fairly decent state. And again, 25, 30 times over 8 years. Not every day, not at every whim, but when a medical professional judged it to be okay. And I think it's important to point out that, he wasn't getting sleep, but you saw him from, he needed fluids, he needed food, he needed fundamental things to be healthy. Yes, and to perform, and to be Michael Jackson. And those things were equally as important, if not more important, than the sleep. Yeah, wow. Well, tell me about your book. You know, it was a labor of love. It took me 5 years. I tried to be as frank and honest as I could. I told the stories as I remembered them. The Michael part, I think I channeled Michael. It was like he was speaking through me. Yeah. You know, it was a cathartic experience. You know, when you write your life, you're doing a recapitulation of all those events. And you see it in a different way because it's many years after the fact. So in many ways, it was difficult. It was incredibly rewarding. It was nice to get all those things on paper. You know, and now, you know, it's kind of my calling card, so to speak, because I would like to go out and be a public speaker. I think I have a lot of good lessons to tell people about. Absolutely. Certainly have a lot of good stories to talk about. Yeah. Yeah, I could take your entire day up, but I won't do that. What is the title of the book? Yeah, the name of the book is Rock Doc, and it's a self-published book, so it's not yet available in bookstores, but it's available in all formats on Amazon. And let me say this, there's a lot of dialogue in the book, and I did all the accents. So you might get a kick out of the audio book. No way. And it's also... I was going to ask, I hope you narrated it, and you did, so okay. I'm going to check I did everything. I was the narrator, and I was every person in the book. And you do different accents. That's good.
And I do accents. I worked with somebody, who was a professional, but you'll get a kick out of it. People will get a kick out of it.
Oh, count me in. It sounds
crazy.
Great. Yeah.
And it's also available, though, on my website, Neil, Neil, Ratner, Ratner, Rockdoc, ROCKDOC.com. If you buy the book off my website, I will autograph it any way you like.
I'm there. You can't autograph the audio one, so I'll buy the book, too. How about that?
All right, I appreciate that, man.
All right, Neil, I'm going to let you go and run and do whatever you're doing today, but I really appreciate your time.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Bruce, and hopefully one day I'll get up to Seattle and we'll meet in person.
Oh, please do.
Or you'll get down to Woodstock. You never know.
Sounds good. I need to do that, too.
Well, I'm here. You know my number.
I've got your number.
All right, Bruce. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
Listening to the Better Each Day podcast radio show with Bruce Hilliard. We'll be back with a new horizon, but until then, honor the future. It comes with a lifetime guarantee.
And we're all just trying to make the next day a bit better.